Here, I briefly outline the state of my research into a trio of evolved functions of musical signals I have observed in various animal clades. These possibly adaptive functions are olfactory compensation, conspecific orientation, and spatiomotive landing. Music is a complex acoustic phenomenon produced by humans. But many other species also produce sounds which overlap with the acoustic features in our music. Ancestral primates were dependent on scent marking for communication, but scent tracking by terrestrial predators necessitated arboreal sheltering and consequently also more complex and discretized vocal communication. Two other habitat-centered explanations on the origins of complex acoustic display in both animals and humans are the acoustic adaptation hypothesis and auditory scene analysis. The acoustic adaptation hypothesis focuses on improvements to signal propagation, for example through dense vegetation, by virtue of particular acoustic features, for example inter-element intervals. Auditory scene analysis focuses on the learned skill of listener-side perception, where individual contiguous sound streams are recovered from a cacophonous mixture of sounds in noisy environments. The acoustic adaptation hypothesis focuses on signalers and receivers, whereas auditory scene analysis pertains just to receiver-side localization of any sounds, natural or unnatural, from conspecific to abiotic. Both the acoustic adaptation hypothesis and auditory scene analysis view musicality as an indirect side effect of habitat adaptations. Over the years that I have grappled with the question of the origins of musicality, I have converged upon the following both adaptive and signaling-based pair of hypotheses. The first is a resurrection of spatial orientation and navigation ideas that I have recently dubbed the paralimbic insular acoustic neighborhood orientation, or piano hypothesis. The second concerns my ideas regarding music-like acoustical displays serving as signals of motive emplacement, including hand-eye, grasp-eye, fin-eye, or even beak-eye coordination for accurately attaining arbitrary targets in space. Piano is an acronym that delineates circuitry for listener-side aptitudes for processing sound signals as residing in the higher periallocortical and adjacent lower archicortical areas of the limbic system, for example, the amygdala. It encompasses the entorhinal cortex, which is composed of increasingly thicker exterior gyres of the hippocampus complex, including the schizocortex, as well as the pre- and parasubiculum. These paralimbic areas reside deep within the medial temporal lobe and overlap not only with olfactory specializations of the paleocortical piriform, but also those of the inferior insula. Paralimbic associated areas facilitate storage of spatial and navigational memory, while the insula is more perceptually gestaltic and socio-emotionally interpersonal. The insula weighs both sensory motor as well as socio-emotional input and helps arbitrate risky decisions, perhaps including those concerning precarious arboreal maneuvers. Animals in chemically diffuse habitats require discretized sound signals. Such syllabically rich gestures not only compensate for lack of smell, but relay spatio-temporal coordinates and may signal functioning navigational and pattern matching abilities. I hypothesized that the same pattern matching faculties that group acoustic units over time could be used to group visual inputs between eyes. This proposed connection between binocular pattern matching and vocal unit matching immediately suggests a type of indicator signaling mechanism. The capacity to rapidly resolve visual targets could be reliably signaled by animals who have learned how to also match acoustic sequences. This implies that the same cognitive circuitry used to process pattern calls are also used to process binocular vision, perhaps for motor control scenarios requiring precision. This underlying visual pattern matching ability is undoubtedly critical for limb landing in primates. My dataset is composed of mainly primate species. To assess their ancestrally selective setting, I collected data on contexts including morphology, behavior, and habitat. To corroborate what brain component functions specifically are being signaled by their musical calls, I also incorporated data on mostly non-neocortical primate brain component volumes. Although I utilized data on human hunter-gatherers and birdsong behavior, I was most interested in what makes certain primates musical. Indri, tarsiers, gibbons, and some New World monkeys have been viewed as producing calls with musical qualities. The musicality of calls can be determined by looking for patterns, for example repetition, transposition, and unit diversity, in sound recordings visualized as spectrograms, or plots of acoustic energy across frequency and over time. I collected vocal repertoires of 58 species corresponding to dozens of genera from nearly all extant primate families. 5 students scored this spectrographic collection along 6 acoustic features: tone, interval, transposition, repetition, rhythm, and syllable count, that are prevalent in the songs of birds and the music of humans. Using these, I developed a principal components analysis reduction-informed metric of acoustic musicality, the Acoustic Reappearance Diversity Index, or ARDI, which estimates the average number of syllables reappearing by repetition or transposition within a call. If we apply this simple formula to a handful of exemplary music-like calls, such as tarsier, gibbon, or lemur duets, we get adjusted syllable count scores that range from 2 to 6 reappearing syllables per call. I used a combination of linear regression, some causal modeling, and a smattering of other plots to uncover associations between contexts of music and musical outputs of birds, primates, and humans. Almost all of these contextual variables associated positively in some way with the musical output of both birds and humans. Predation and associated capacities for smell were the only variables that were negatively correlated with musical output. Group size and sex had mixed results. Arboreality was at times negative, but it was also highly masked by the locomotion variables. Notably, males had slightly less musical output than females. Territorial displays far outperformed foraging or sociosexual call types, and individual musical features such as tone and syllable associated most strongly with affiliative foraging and territorial display calls respectively. If we contrast shorter, more transpositionally musical calls to longer song-like calls, we find closer affiliative and mother-infant associated call types emerge. Juveniles had the lowest scoring calls, suggesting that infants likely benefit from maternal tutoring, that primates ameliorate forms of musicality with age, and that such calls could be an important part of socio-vocal maturity, such as for range defense and mating. An increase in ARDI from younger exploratory calls to adult territorial calls suggests musical maturity may signal a broadening awareness of the spatial dispersion of conspecifics. In birds, habitat had surprisingly weak associations of musicality, but targeting had strong ones, especially for small or moving food items, such as seeds, insects, or wind-blown foliage. Locomotion-wise, leaping and swinging were highly correlated with vocal complexity in primates. The more musical features multiplied into ARDI, such as the figure on the right, the stronger this association becomes. As predicted, ARDI was positively correlated with vision, spatial, and motor, but not olfactory brain areas. All musical features were negatively associated with smell. Syllable count was the musical feature most strongly negative, confirming this core prerequisite assumption of the piano hypothesis. Tone and interval were features most strongly correlated with paralimbic associated spatial areas, including the hippocampus. Interval and transposition associated strongly with motor areas, suggesting that frequency modulation, both within and between vocal units, constitutes a challenging motor feat signaled by spectrally vigorous calling. Repetition had the strongest correlation with visual areas, confirming piano's binocular pattern matching prediction. In humans, hunting of land animals, presumably via ballistics, had strong correlations with both rhythmic and melodic tension. The noses of bipedal hominids are meters above the ground compared to other terrestrial primates who are largely quadrupedal. This difference could explain our continued use of diverse and discrete syllables well after our shift to full-time terrestriality. These correlations also suggest that our repetitive and spectrally exacting musicality could signal fine motor control for hand-eye coordination involved in landing ballistics. For example, on moving prey. In conclusion, complex, highly syllabic musical signals evolved in primates and birds to compensate for lack of smell in arboreally ventilated habitats. In visually occluded, and oftentimes also arboreal habitats, musical calls help species to auditorially distinguish themselves from background noise as well as from conspecifics, for example, a vigorous mate or a formidable competitor. Gravitationally hazardous or otherwise gravis locomotion between branches or trunks and trees, where split-second reflexes are required to land precarious aerial maneuvers, appears to be signaled by rapid frequency changes, for example via interval and transposition. Highly repetitive calls may affect greater response in terrestrial species that have become more visually social, but do not spend as much time using vision for fusing interorbital sensory contours, as would be used in rapid arboreal locomotion. Monotonicity did not correlate highly with many parts, but more complex rhythms may have arisen epiphenomenally to more ancestrally routine locomotion. A consistent, about 10% drop in spectral feature scores suggests vestigiality for terrestrial over arboreal species. In terrestrial species, this increase in max but not mean temporal feature scores possibly indicates ornamental selection. In summary, birds with higher song-to-call ratios appear to target their beaks on smaller dietary items such as seeds and insects. Also, like primates, many must frequently resolve thin branch contours for frequent locomotive landing. Hardy correlates well with forms of gravis grasp landings, such as leaping and swinging, as well as brain parts involved in vision, spatial capacities, and motor control. Most relevant to piano and motive emplacement, spatial and motor areas associated most strongly with the spectral measures of interval, tone, and transposition. An association of visual areas with repetition, but a lack of association of spatial areas with transposition, lends only partial support to auditory scene analysis. And while intervallic acoustic adaptation hypothesis was not supported here, a version that highlights syllables may be. As per adaptive significance, we might leverage these average versus maximum scores as a clue to how routine versus vestigial or ornamental the emphasis on certain musical features is to species inhabiting certain environments. For example, a possible spectral but not temporal vestigiality in ground primates is compatible with marginally positive selection for rhythmic ornamentation, but merely stabilizing selection for syllabic complexity in hominins. This combination likely paved the way for continued development of linguistic capacities in our own lineage, as well as endowing us with musicality increasingly rich in group-conducive rhythmic complexity. Thank you.